Officer, why was I stopped?
Stolen vehicle report, license and registration.
Now, what's the report number?
I'm not debating with you. Hand over your documents.
I need to know why I'm being detained.
You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm asking a simple legal...
Judge Jennifer Harold was 2 miles from home when Sheriff Samuel Hemsworth's patrol lights lit up behind her. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any lights, hadn't violated a single traffic law. She was a federal judge about to become the target of the kind of racial profiling she'd spent her career fighting against. What Hemsworth didn't know, 5 cameras were capturing everything he was about to do. The woman he was pulling over could seal federal indictments that toppled criminal organizations. The briefcase sitting on her passenger seat contained classified documents that would trigger a national security response within minutes. And the fabricated traffic stop he was conducting would unravel a 15-year criminal enterprise, end with 52 years in federal prison, and result in $35 million in damages, all of which would fund the very organizations working to end police corruption. If you're ready to see how one woman dismantled institutional racism with nothing but composure and evidence, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of people who messed with the absolute wrong person. Let's continue. Judge Jennifer Harold was 42 years old. She had graduated in the top 5% of her class from Georgetown Law School, spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor with a 94% conviction rate on public corruption cases, and clerked for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Her appointment to the federal bench 4 years earlier had survived Senate confirmation hearings so rigorous they had examined her college parking tickets. She presided over cases involving organized crime, government corruption, and national security matters. She had the authority to classify court proceedings, issue warrants that could freeze assets across international borders, and make decisions that set legal precedent affecting millions of lives. On this particular Thursday afternoon in October, Harold was driving home from the federal courthouse in Houston, taking her usual route through the quiet suburbs. Personal vehicle, a midnight blue Lexus LS 500 she had purchased after 3 years of careful saving from her federal salary. Texas plates clearly visible. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, pearl earrings, and the small federal judiciary lapel pin on her collar that identified her to those who knew what to look for. She had spent the morning reviewing classified briefings on a counterterrorism case. The documents sat in her briefcase on the passenger seat, each one stamped with security classifications that made them federal property under strict handling protocols. She was mentally reviewing her evening schedule, thinking about picking up groceries, when the blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror. That was when Sheriff Samuel Hemsworth of Kendall County decided to pull her over. Harold signaled and pulled into a bank parking lot, following proper procedure. She placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock and waited. Her dash cam activated automatically, a standard security measure for federal judges who made decisions that affected powerful people. Hemsworth approached with body language that spoke of authority assumed rather than earned, hand hovering near his service weapon, aviator sunglasses concealing his eyes, shoulders tight, jaw set in an expression that suggested judgments had already been made. He demanded her license and registration without preamble. Harold's voice carried the same measured authority that commanded federal courtrooms. She asked why she had been stopped. Hemsworth's response came without hesitation. Multiple reports of a stolen Lexus in the area. Her vehicle matched the description. Harold's legal training activated instantly. Stolen vehicle reports were documented, time-stamped, and verifiable through dispatch within seconds. The claim was either legitimate or fabricated. There was no middle ground. She asked calmly for the report number. Hemsworth's jaw tightened. He repeated his demand for license and registration, voice harder this time. Harold announced each movement as she reached slowly for her purse on the passenger seat. Her fingers found the leather wallet that contained her Texas driver's license and her federal judicial identification. She withdrew both documents and extended them through the window. The federal credentials were unmistakable. Official seal of the United States District Court embossed in gold. Photograph. Full name, Jennifer Marie Harold. Title, United States District Judge, Southern District of Texas. Lifetime appointment designation. Security features designed to prevent forgery. Hemsworth examined the credentials for approximately 4 seconds. His expression remained unchanged, skeptical, hostile, dismissive in equal measure. His assessment was delivered with finality. The credentials could be fake. She needed to step out of the vehicle. Harold felt something cold settle in her chest. She had spent 8 years prosecuting civil rights violations. She knew exactly what was happening. She had seen it in case files, in victim testimony, in patterns of discriminatory enforcement that prosecutors documented with statistical precision. She had never imagined experiencing it herself. She stated clearly that the credentials were issued by the United States District Court. They could be verified immediately through federal databases. Her vehicle registration was current and legitimate. There was no legal basis for the stop to continue. Hemsworth's response was a command, not a request. "Step out of the vehicle. Don't make me ask again." What neither of them knew, they were being recorded from 5 different angles. Harold's dashcam captured everything through the windshield in high definition. The bank's security system monitored the parking lot from 3 different positions, each camera covering overlapping fields of view with timestamps synchronized to the second. And across the street, a construction worker named David Ellis sat in his truck eating lunch. He had noticed the traffic stop, thought the officer's aggressive posture looked wrong, and pulled out his phone to record. Harold complied with the order. She opened her door slowly, stepped out with deliberate movements, and stood beside her Lexus with her hands visible at her sides. Her mind was already cataloging details with the precision that had made her one of the most meticulous judges in the Southern District. Time, 3:58 p.m. Location, Westheimer Road, 6 miles from the federal courthouse. Witnesses, at least 3 bank customers within visual range. Construction worker across the street, bank employees visible through windows. Hemsworth radioed for backup. His voice carried across the parking lot, professional bureaucratic language that completely misrepresented reality. Suspicious vehicle stop. Subject claiming to be a federal judge but unable to explain why she was driving a $60,000 luxury car. Harold's correction was immediate and clear. She had never stated she couldn't explain her vehicle. Federal judicial salaries were public record, and he had never attempted to verify her credentials through any official database. The response was captured by all 5 cameras with perfect audio clarity. Deputy Lewis Garrett arrived within 6 minutes. Mid-30s, less experienced than Hemsworth by perhaps a decade, he deferred immediately to the senior officer's authority, without question. Hemsworth briefed him quickly. Possible stolen vehicle, subject being uncooperative. He was going to search the car. Harold stated her position with the same clarity she used when addressing attorneys who appeared before her bench. She did not consent to any search. No probable cause had been articulated. Her federal credentials established her identity beyond question. The stop was unlawful, and the proposed search would constitute a violation of her Fourth Amendment rights. Hemsworth ignored her completely. He claimed reasonable suspicion based on the stolen vehicle report justified a search under established precedent. Harold's response was procedural and precise. If a stolen vehicle report existed, he could provide the report number and she would wait while dispatch confirmed it through official channels. Hemsworth's face flushed red. He ordered her to step away from the vehicle. Hemsworth opened the driver's door. On the passenger seat sat Harold's leather briefcase, black calfskin with the federal court seal embossed in gold lettering visible even through the tinted windows. Beside it lay a sealed manila envelope marked in bold red letters, classified, national security, authorized personnel only. Harold's voice carried absolute judicial authority despite her position standing handcuffed beside a patrol vehicle. That briefcase contained classified federal court documents. Opening it without proper security clearance constituted a federal crime under Title 18 of the United States Code. She was ordering him as a federal judge to cease immediately. Hemsworth pulled the briefcase from the vehicle. He characterized it as evidence in the vehicle theft investigation. Harold's response was factual and devastating. There was no vehicle theft investigation. The claim was fabricated and provably false through dispatch records that would show no such report had ever been filed. Hemsworth forced the briefcase lock. The leather tore. The mechanism broke. Inside lay multiple case files, each one bearing security classifications stamped in red ink. One file, marked with diagonal red stripes and a classification level that required special federal clearance, pertained to an ongoing counterterrorism investigation with international implications. Garrett hesitated visibly. The markings looked official. Maybe they should contact a supervisor before proceeding. Hemsworth's order was unequivocal. Photograph everything. Standard evidence collection procedure. Hemsworth pulled out his personal cell phone and began photographing pages. The camera shutter sound clicked repeatedly in the quiet afternoon. Classified witness identities under federal protection programs. Sealed investigative findings from Homeland Security operations. Security protocols for ongoing counterterrorism activities. Methods and sources whose disclosure could compromise national security operations across multiple countries. Harold stood perfectly still, but her mind was documenting everything with legal precision that would later be described in federal court testimony as extraordinary. Each photograph created time-stamped metadata. Each image automatically uploaded to cloud storage systems beyond anyone's ability to delete. Each action was being captured by 5 separate recording devices from 5 different angles. She spoke clearly and steadily, ensuring her words would be captured by every microphone. Hemsworth and Garrett were photographing classified national security documents without authorization. This constituted a federal crime under Title 18, United States Code. She was a sitting federal judge, and she was documenting their actions for federal prosecution. Garrett pulled out his own phone and began photographing different sections of the documents. The total came to 70 pages. 43 photographed by Hemsworth, 27 by Garrett, all uploaded to cloud storage within seconds. All time-stamped with metadata that would prove impossible to dispute. All captured on 5 cameras that neither officer knew existed. What Hemsworth didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he photographed page after page with meticulous attention to detail, was that one of those files contained far more than classified counterterrorism intelligence. It was an internal investigation by the Department of Justice, Office of Inspector General. The subject: illegal law enforcement database access and sale of confidential information across multiple Texas counties. The investigation had been active for 14 months. It had identified patterns of unauthorized queries, traced payments through banking systems, and documented a criminal enterprise that had operated for 15 years. On page 7 of that investigation, in a document marked with the highest level of classification, appeared a name typed in precise legal formatting: Sheriff Samuel Hemsworth, Kendall County. He had just photographed evidence of the federal investigation into his own criminal activities, with metadata showing exact timestamps, with cloud backups creating permanent records, with 5 cameras capturing every moment. He hadn't profiled a random black woman driving a car he thought she couldn't afford. He had profiled the federal judge who would have eventually presided over his criminal trial. And he had just handed her irrefutable evidence of federal obstruction to add to the charges that would end his career and his freedom. The handcuffs clicked onto Harold's wrists with excessive force. Hemsworth tightened them deliberately, metal biting into skin, leaving marks that would still be visible hours later when federal photographers documented every detail as evidence. Across the parking lot, 3 bank customers had stopped their activities entirely, frozen in various states of shock as they watched a woman in a business suit being arrested beside a luxury vehicle. One woman had her phone out, recording. The construction worker across the street had never stopped filming. Harold was placed in the back seat of Hemsworth's patrol vehicle. The plastic was hard and uncomfortable. The cage separating front from back created a physical barrier that would later be described in legal filings as symbolically appropriate, a barrier between law enforcement authority and judicial oversight, between power assumed and power accountable. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead. Federal marshals would be mobilized within minutes of her missing a mandatory security check-in. Every action had been documented by multiple recording systems. Every photograph had created evidence with timestamps impossible to dispute. The legal framework for federal prosecution was building itself with the precision of a case she might have overseen from the bench. The drive to Kendall County Sheriff's Department took 18 minutes. Harold sat in silence, mentally reviewing federal statutes with the same attention to detail she applied to every case that came before her court. Time was now 4:12 p.m. 14 minutes past her scheduled check-in. At the federal courthouse in Houston, Judicial Assistant Robert Stevens checked his watch for the 3rd time. 4:12 p.m. Judge Harold's mandatory security check-in had been scheduled for precisely 4 o'clock. He tried her cell phone. The call went directly to voicemail. Stevens had worked for federal judges for 19 years. He understood their patterns, their reliability, their adherence to security protocols that existed for reasons carved from hard experience. Judge Harold was known throughout the Southern District for punctuality that bordered on obsessive. She confirmed appointments hours in advance. She returned calls within minutes. She had never, not once in 4 years, missed a scheduled security check-in without prior notification. He waited exactly 2 minutes and tried again. 4:14 p.m. Voicemail. At 4:15 p.m., Stevens activated the protocol that existed specifically for this scenario. The call went to Deputy U.S. Marshal Angela Reeves, who handled judicial security for the Southern District of Texas. Reeves had spent 16 years protecting federal judges from threats that ranged from disgruntled defendants to organized crime organizations to foreign intelligence services. She understood immediately that this wasn't administrative oversight or a forgotten phone call. Federal judges operated under specific security protocols because their decisions affected powerful interests. Death threats were constant. Kidnapping was a documented risk. Assassination attempts had occurred with enough frequency that protective measures were mandatory rather than optional. When a federal judge missed a scheduled check-in, the response was immediate and comprehensive. Reeves accessed the tracking system for court-issued devices within seconds. Harold's phone had last pinged a cell tower on Westheimer Road at 3:58 p.m. The location data placed her at a bank parking lot 6 miles from the courthouse. There had been no movement since. The U.S. Marshal Service team dispatched immediately. 3 vehicles, 7 agents, full emergency protocol. Deputy Marshal Reeves and her team arrived at the bank parking lot at 4:31 p.m. Harold's Lexus sat in space B7, exactly where the tracking data had indicated. Driver's door closed but unlocked. No sign of the judge, no indication of where she had gone or why. Reeves approached the bank manager and requested immediate access to security footage. Federal emergency, missing federal judge. The manager complied within minutes. The recording showed everything. 3:58 p.m., midnight blue Lexus pulls into parking lot. Professional black woman in business suit exits, vehicle, hands on steering wheel, compliant posture. Sheriff's patrol vehicle blocks her exit. 4:01 p.m. Officer approaches aggressively, hand near weapon. Woman presents credentials, visible even on security footage as she extends documents through window. 4:03 p.m. Officer examines credentials briefly, orders woman from vehicle. 4:06 p.m. Backup arrives. 4:09 p.m. Briefcase removed from passenger seat, forced open despite woman's visible objections. 4:11 p.m. through 4:18 p.m. Both officers photographing documents with personal phones. 4:21 p.m. Woman handcuffed and placed in patrol vehicle. 4:23 p.m. Patrol vehicle departs with woman in custody. Reeves watched the footage twice, her expression growing harder with each viewing. Then she pulled out her phone and called Kendall County Sheriff's Department directly. The desk sergeant answered with routine professional courtesy. Reeves identified herself with formal precision. Deputy U.S. Marshal, Southern District of Texas, Judicial Security Division. She needed immediate confirmation of whether they had anyone matching a specific description in custody. The sergeant checked the intake system. Subject matching description brought in approximately 25 minutes earlier, currently in holding, pending processing. Reeves asked what charges had been filed. Her voice remained controlled, professional, giving no indication of what was coming. The sergeant read from the screen. Obstruction of justice. Suspected involvement in vehicle theft operation. The silence on Reeves' end stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. When she spoke again, her voice had transformed completely. Each word carried the weight of federal authority mobilizing in real time. They had a United States District Judge in custody. Federal judicial credentials had been presented and ignored. Classified national security documents had been accessed without authorization. This was now a federal incident. They were not to process that individual any further. They were not to move her. They were not to speak to her. Federal agents were en route and would arrive within minutes. The sergeant's tone transformed from bureaucratic routine to barely controlled panic. Captain Vincent Drake had been with Kendall County Sheriff's Department for 24 years. He had handled internal corruption investigations that had ended careers. He had managed officer-involved shootings that had generated national media attention. He had survived federal civil rights audits and budget crises that had nearly bankrupted the department. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what the desk sergeant reported. Drake reached the holding area within 3 minutes. Judge Harold sat on the concrete bench, suit jacket folded beside her. tie still knotted, posture upright despite the degrading circumstances. Her expression was calm, professional, and absolutely controlled. There was no anger visible in her face, no frustration, no fear. Only the kind of composed authority that made Drake's prepared apologies die in his throat. He began to speak. "Judge Harold, I am so." She interrupted with a single question, delivered with the same tone she used when questioning attorneys who appeared unprepared before her bench. Where were the documents that had been photographed from her briefcase? Drake checked the evidence log with hands that had begun to tremble. The entry was there in digital precision. Briefcase contents photographed by officers Hemsworth and Garrett for evidence purposes. 43 pages photographed by Hemsworth. 27 pages photographed by Garrett. Total of 70 classified documents. All images time-stamped. All automatically uploaded to personal cloud storage accounts before the phones had been secured. Harold asked her second question. Were any of those documents marked as classified? Drake felt the blood drain from his face as he read further down the evidence log. Yes. Multiple files marked classified. Multiple files marked national security. Multiple files with security classifications that required federal clearance levels his entire department combined didn't possess. Harold delivered her third question with devastating calm. How many of those photographs had been uploaded to cloud storage before the phones were secured? Drake checked the evidence documentation with growing horror. His voice came out barely above a whisper. All of them. Automatic cloud backup, 70 images, uploaded within seconds of being photographed. Stored on servers beyond anyone's ability to delete. Harold stood. She straightened her suit jacket with movements that belonged in a courtroom rather than a holding cell. Her voice remained measured, judicial, almost gentle in its absolute certainty. Sheriff Hemsworth and Deputy Garrett had committed multiple federal crimes: unauthorized access to classified national security information, obstruction of federal judicial proceedings, violation of court-sealed documents under federal protection. Each violation carried mandatory minimum sentences measured in years rather than months. She paused deliberately before delivering the detail that transformed everything. Among those 70 photographed pages had been an ongoing investigation by the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General. The subject of that investigation: illegal law enforcement database access and sale of confidential information across multiple Texas counties. Sheriff Samuel Hemsworth's activities had been under federal investigation for 14 months. Drake's expression cycled through shock, comprehension, and complete understanding of catastrophe. Harold continued in the same measured tone. Hemsworth had just photographed evidence from the federal investigation into his own criminal enterprise, with metadata showing exact timestamps, with cloud backups creating permanent federal records, with 5 separate cameras capturing every moment from 5 different angles. The final statement was delivered with surgical precision. He hadn't profiled a random black woman driving a car he assumed she couldn't afford. He had profiled the federal judge who would have eventually presided over his criminal trial. And he had just created irrefutable evidence of federal obstruction to add to charges that would already end his career and his freedom. Do you think this would have happened if Judge Harold had been white? Drop yes or no in the comments and tell me why you think that. And hit that share button, because people need to see how justice actually works when it's backed by evidence and institutional authority. Harold was released at 4:47 p.m., exactly 90 minutes after the initial traffic stop. Federal agents had secured the scene. Every phone had been seized. Every camera had been identified. Every piece of evidence had been preserved under federal chain of custody protocols that would survive any legal challenge. She drove directly to the federal courthouse, hands still bearing visible marks from handcuffs that had been deliberately tightened. Once in her chambers, she began making the calls that would trigger comprehensive institutional response. Chief Judge Patricia Vega took her call immediately. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. Full federal investigation was mandatory. Resources would be unlimited. Consequences would be maximum. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. The senior attorney recognized implications within seconds of Harold's briefing. Federal obstruction. Classified information breach. Civil rights deprivation under color of law. Investigative team deployment was promised within hours. National Security Division was notified due to the classified document compromise. Counterterrorism protocols were activated immediately. By 6:15 p.m., federal investigators had executed simultaneous search warrants across 3 counties. All electronic devices were seized from Hemsworth, Garrett, and 4 additional deputies who had been identified through preliminary communication analysis. Phones, computers, tablets, personal and departmental servers, everything that could store data, everything that could contain evidence. The forensic examination would take 3 months. What they found would exceed even the federal investigators' initial expectations. 623 traffic stops conducted by Hemsworth over 15 years. 91% had involved minority drivers. The counties where he operated showed 71% white population according to census data. Statistical analysis would later prove the disparity represented mathematical impossibility without intentional racial targeting. 1,847 unauthorized database queries over the same 15-year period. Information sold to 23 different clients, including private investigators, bail bondsmen, and tabloid journalists. $340,000 in traceable payments through banking records that Hemsworth had apparently believed were secure. Text messages spanning 8 years. Racist language documented in digital permanence. Communications coordinating racial profiling activities with other deputies. Celebrations of arrest quotas. Mockery of minority drivers using slurs that would be read aloud in federal court. 6 additional deputies identified as participants in the database selling operation. A systematic criminal enterprise with Hemsworth as the architect and primary beneficiary. The evidence was overwhelming. The documentation was irrefutable. And all of it had been preserved because a federal judge had maintained perfect composure while being humiliated, had documented every detail with legal precision, and had trusted that the system designed to protect judicial independence would function exactly as intended when provided with undeniable evidence. The federal grand jury convened 11 months after the bank parking lot incident. The indictment they returned was 49 pages long, detailing 49 separate federal counts against Sheriff Samuel Hemsworth. Each count was supported by evidence so overwhelming that defense attorneys would later describe it as the most thoroughly documented prosecution they had ever seen. The trial began on a Monday morning in September. Federal courtroom in Houston. Judge Michael Rousseau, presiding, brought in from the Eastern District of Texas to ensure impartiality. He was known throughout the Fifth Circuit for harsh sentences in cases involving law enforcement corruption and had precisely zero tolerance for officers who betrayed the public trust. The prosecution presented their case across 4 weeks with methodical precision. Every piece of evidence was introduced with careful attention to chain of custody. Every witness was prepared to withstand aggressive cross-examination. Every exhibit told a story of systematic abuse that had operated for 15 years while department supervision had looked the other way. Video evidence came first. 5 camera angles from the bank parking lot, synchronized to show the same events from different perspectives. High-definition footage showing Harold's Lexus pulling into the parking lot at 3:58 p.m. Crystal-clear audio of Harold asking why she had been stopped. Hemsworth's claim about a stolen vehicle report. Harold presenting federal credentials. Hemsworth examining them for 4 seconds before dismissing them as potentially fake. The forced search of the briefcase despite Harold's explicit denial of consent. 70 photographs being taken of classified documents over the course of 9 minutes. The defense had no effective response to video evidence that had been authenticated by 5 different sources. Forensic evidence followed. Computer crimes specialists testified about metadata extraction from the 70 photographs. Each image contained GPS coordinates placing Hemsworth at the exact location where the stop had occurred. Each image contained timestamps accurate to the second. Each image had been automatically uploaded to cloud storage, creating permanent records that existed on servers in 3 different states before Hemsworth had even returned to his patrol vehicle. Banking records traced $340,000 in payments to Hemsworth over 15 years. 23 different sources. Private investigators paying for background checks that required law enforcement database access. Bail bondsmen paying for arrest information that gave them competitive advantages. Tabloid journalists paying for celebrity mugshots and arrest records. Every transaction documented, every payment traceable, every deposit made to accounts Hemsworth had apparently believed were untraceable. The database access log showed 1,847 unauthorized queries. Searches on celebrities, politicians, business executives, private citizens who had done nothing to warrant law enforcement attention. Each query time-stamped. Each query matched to payments that followed within days. The pattern was undeniable and impossible to explain as anything except systematic criminal enterprise. Statistical analysis was presented by an expert who had testified in civil rights cases across the country. 623 traffic stops by Hemsworth over 15 years. 567 had involved minority drivers. The counties where Hemsworth operated showed 71% white population according to census data. The expert testified that achieving a 91% minority stop rate in a 71% white county without intentional racial targeting had a statistical probability approaching zero. Comparison data from other officers in the same department showed stop rates that aligned with demographic patterns. Hemsworth was an extreme outlier. The numbers proved discriminatory intent beyond any reasonable doubt. Text messages were read aloud in court. 8 years of communications with other deputies. Racist language that made jury members visibly uncomfortable. Coordination of profiling activities with specific discussion of targeting expensive vehicles in certain neighborhoods. Celebration of arrest quotas with bonuses apparently paid under the table by the department. Mockery of minority drivers using slurs that the prosecutor read in a flat, emotionless voice that somehow made them even more damning. The defense attempted to argue isolated incidents taken out of context. The prosecution responded by presenting additional messages from different time periods showing identical patterns. The argument collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. Harold took the witness stand on the trial's 15th day. She testified for 7 hours across 3 sessions, describing the bank parking lot stop with precise detail. Her voice never wavered. Her composure remained absolute. She described presenting her federal credentials and watching Hemsworth examine them for 4 seconds before dismissing them as potentially fake. She described explicitly denying consent to search her vehicle and hearing that denial ignored. She described watching classified national security documents being photographed despite her clear warnings about federal law violations. The defense cross-examination attempted to suggest she had been uncooperative or had somehow provoked the situation. Harold's responses were devastating in their simplicity. She had answered every question asked. She had complied with every lawful order. She had presented valid federal credentials. She had explained exactly why the search was unlawful. Her cooperation had been total within the bounds of constitutional protection she had every right to invoke. Her final statement was delivered with quiet intensity that resonated through the courtroom. She had spent her career upholding the Constitution. On that October afternoon, she had experienced its violation firsthand. Not because she had committed any crime, not because she had acted suspiciously, but because of the color of her skin and the car she drove. 29 other victims testified over the following week. A woman who had lost custody of her children after a fabricated arrest led to Child Protective Services involvement. An elderly man who had been hospitalized after being thrown to the ground during a pretextual stop. A young entrepreneur whose business had failed after bogus charges destroyed his reputation. Charges that were eventually dismissed, but only after the damage had been done. The pattern emerged with brutal clarity. Systematic destruction of lives through racial profiling conducted with the authority of law enforcement and protected by department supervision that had looked the other way for 15 years. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on all 49 federal counts. 8 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. 12 counts of unauthorized access to classified information. 7 counts of obstruction of justice. 15 counts of computer fraud and abuse. 5 counts of wire fraud. 2 counts of conspiracy. No acquittals. No hung jury on any charge. Hemsworth sat without visible emotion as the verdict was read. His attorney appeared physically ill. Judge Rousseau scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Prosecution argued for upward departure from federal sentencing guidelines based on aggravating circumstances. They presented victim impact statements from 37 individuals whose lives had been affected by Hemsworth's actions. They documented systematic abuse spanning 15 years. They emphasized the national security breach created by photographing classified documents and the assault on judicial independence represented by arresting a federal judge who had presented valid credentials. The defense pleaded for leniency. They mentioned family circumstances. They cited military service from 20 years earlier. They expressed remorse that sounded hollow, given text messages celebrating arrests and mocking victims. Judge Rousseau's sentencing statement addressed each aggravating factor with methodical precision. Hemsworth hadn't just violated individual rights. He had betrayed the fundamental trust that communities placed in law enforcement. He had weaponized his authority against the very people he had sworn to protect. He had racially profiled hundreds of citizens. He had sold confidential information for personal profit, and when he had encountered a federal judge, he had committed crimes against the judicial system itself. The sentence was pronounced with finality that left no room for appeal. 52 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole under federal sentencing guidelines. Hemsworth would be 84 years old before release eligibility. It was, for all practical purposes, a life sentence. All pension benefits were revoked. Law enforcement certification was permanently stripped. Appeals were filed to the Fifth Circuit and denied. Petition to the Supreme Court was denied without comment. Every possible avenue of escape was systematically closed. Deputy Garrett received 23 years for accessory charges and obstruction. 4 other deputies received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years each for their participation in the database selling operation. The department supervisor received 11 years for systematically covering up complaints and enabling the profiling network through deliberate indifference. The entire criminal enterprise was dismantled, 6 careers ended, multiple families destroyed, and all of it traceable to a single decision to profile a woman based on the color of her skin and the car she drove. The civil lawsuit proceeded on a parallel track, Harold v. Kendall County Sheriff's Department and Samuel Hemsworth. Claims of false arrest, civil rights deprivation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, assault on judicial independence, and systematic failure of supervision that had enabled the constitutional violations. The county offered settlement 3 months before trial, $3.9 million with a confidentiality agreement requiring Harold to never discuss the case publicly. Their attorneys characterized it as generous given the circumstances. Harold refused. She demanded public trial and institutional accountability that a confidential settlement would obscure. The case proceeded to jury trial. The civil trial lasted 4 weeks. Evidence showed the department had received 47 formal complaints against Hemsworth over 15 years. Every single complaint had been dismissed internally without proper investigation. Early intervention systems had flagged Hemsworth's stop patterns as statistical outliers. Supervision had ignored the warnings. The department had created a culture that rewarded aggressive enforcement without meaningful accountability. The verdict came back with numbers that made national headlines: $35 million in total damages, $10 million compensatory for the harm inflicted, $25 million punitive, specifically designed to punish the department for systematic indifference to constitutional violations that had been documented and ignored for over a decade. It was the largest civil rights verdict in Texas history. The federal consent decree that followed was comprehensive and binding. 10 years of Department of Justice monitoring. Independent oversight board with subpoena authority and power to investigate complaints without department interference. Mandatory body cameras for all officers with footage stored by independent third parties. Bias training completely redesigned by civil rights experts rather than law enforcement personnel. Early intervention systems with automatic triggers that required investigation when officers showed statistical patterns of discriminatory enforcement. All stop data tracked by demographics with quarterly public reporting that would be available to researchers and civil rights organizations. The reforms would affect every officer in the department. The oversight would continue for a decade, and the changes would serve as a model for other jurisdictions facing similar patterns of discriminatory enforcement. 3 weeks after the civil verdict, Harold held a press conference at the federal courthouse. She stood at a podium bearing the seal of the United States District Court and delivered a statement that had been carefully prepared but was delivered with obvious emotion barely held in check. She hadn't pursued the case for money. She had pursued it for justice. Every single dollar of the $35 million settlement would be donated to organizations working to prevent what had happened to her from happening to others. The donations were announced with specific amounts. $12 million to the National Police Accountability Project, $10 million to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, $8 million to the Innocence Project, $5 million to local community legal aid organizations that provided representation to defendants who couldn't afford attorneys. The entire settlement. Not a dollar kept for personal use. All of it channeled into systemic reform. The Foundation for Judicial Accountability was established using Harold's name and funded by the settlement. Its mission focused on 3 areas: funding appeals for wrongful convictions, providing legal aid to those unable to afford representation, and developing training programs for law enforcement and judicial officers. The Foundation's results over the following 3 years exceeded even optimistic projections. 24 wrongfully convicted individuals were freed, their cases overturned based on evidence the Foundation's investigators uncovered. Legal representation was provided to over 400 defendants facing charges similar to those Hemsworth had fabricated minor traffic stops that had escalated into serious charges through patterns of discriminatory enforcement. Model legislation developed by the Foundation was adopted by 9 states. The reforms addressed early intervention systems, independent oversight, and public reporting of stop data. Federal judicial conferences began using the case as a teaching tool for maintaining security protocols and responding to threats against judicial independence. FBI training programs incorporated the case into civil rights violation modules. The transformation was comprehensive. What had begun as a single act of racial profiling had exposed a 15-year criminal enterprise and created institutional reforms that would affect thousands of cases across multiple states. The final image crystallized the complete reversal. Hemsworth in federal prison, stripped of authority and freedom, serving a sentence that would end only with death. Uniform replaced by prison clothing. Authority reduced to nothing. Freedom measured in decades that would never be experienced. Harold in judicial robes, continuing to serve from the federal bench with the same composed authority she had demonstrated while handcuffed in a bank parking lot. Still presiding over cases affecting millions of lives. Still making decisions that set legal precedent. Still embodying the principle that justice properly administered could survive any assault and emerge stronger. Sometimes justice wasn't just served, sometimes it was delivered with 52 years of consequences and a $35 million investment in preventing it from ever happening again.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.